Hey guys, tonight we begin with a city that looks like it was designed by a drunk architect. Venice. A city that shouldn't exist, but somehow does, floating like an elegant accident that's been holding itself together for 1,500 years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before Venice became a floating jewel of art and architecture, it was just a swamp so unpleasant even mosquitoes needed therapy afterward. Imagine endless marshes, saltwater puddles and mud that could eat your sandals. That was the Venetian lagoon. The only thing it had going for it was that no one else wanted it. Back in the days of ancient Rome, this region was less La Serenissima and more La Swampissima. The empire that built aqueducts across mountains and bathhouses heated by science looked at this soggy mess and said, "Nope." You can picture a Roman surveyor standing ankle-deep in muck, sketching for a minute, then quietly tearing up the papyrus and going home early. Still, the Romans being Romans, they couldn't leave it completely alone. They built a few fishing posts and docks around the edges, mostly for the glory of trade and the occasional tax collection. But even they knew this wasn't the place for grand monuments. You can't exactly build a Colosseum when your foundation jiggles like pudding. They called the area Venice, plural, because there were multiple little islands, and probably multiple bad decisions involved in living on them. The locals were fishermen, salt collectors, and people who had apparently lost a bet with the gods. The lagoon offered protection, yes, but also ankle-deep misery for eternity. For centuries, the place just sat there, half land, half water, all damp. Rome ignored it, historians ignored it, even invaders ignored it. Nobody wanted to sack a place that already looked half-sacked. Then, in the 5th century, when the Roman Empire finally collapsed like an overcooked lasagna, barbarians swept through Italy, burning cities to the ground. The survivors looked around and thought, where can we go that no sane person would follow? And someone pointed to the lagoon. Problem solved. So they waded in, built huts on stilts, and told themselves it was temporary, the way every bad decision starts. They had no idea they were founding a city that would one day outlast empires. Rome's marble cracked. Its temples fell. Its emperors faded into myth. But the swamp? The swamp endured. Venice was born not out of ambition or destiny, but pure waterlogged stubbornness. The Roman Empire finally collapsed, spectacularly, like a marble building that forgot about gravity. Barbarians stormed Italy, burning cities, looting churches, and giving historians something to write about for the next 1,500 years. For the survivors, there were two options: stay and die heroically, or leave and live soggily. Most chose the second. They fled north, into the marshy Venetian lagoon, a landscape so bleak it made exile look like a spa day. It was here that refugees from cities like Padua, Aquileia, and Altinum stumbled through waist-deep mud, and collectively decided, fine, we live here now. That's how Venice started, as a group of desperate people hiding from civilization on an island that didn't want them either. There was no solid ground, no farmland, and definitely no plan. These were city dwellers trying to survive in a floating compost heap. The first Venetian homes were rickety wooden huts balanced on planks, supported by logs jammed into the mud. If the tide rose too high, your living room simply became a small indoor lake. You can imagine the early meetings. Should we leave? No, the barbarians are still out there. Should we build somewhere drier? No, that would make sense. So they stayed, hammering tree trunks into the lagoon one by one, turning a swamp into a forest you couldn't walk through. They didn't know it yet, but they were creating the foundations for one of history's strangest cities. The wood came from far away, oak, alder, and larch from alpine forests, dragged by boat down rivers and across trade routes. Each log was a promise that maybe, just maybe, this place wouldn't sink before lunch. They piled thousands of them together, layer after layer, until the ground stopped squishing. That's how Venice began, as a refugee camp that accidentally discovered civil engineering. The early Venetians weren't thinkers or architects. They were survivors with hammers. They didn't care about beauty. They cared about not drowning. But as centuries passed, those soggy platforms hardened, the logs petrified, and the impossible city began to take shape. Venice was never planned. It was improvised, the longest-running temporary solution in world history. And somehow, it held. By the 6th century, the refugees had officially gone from temporary squatters to unintentionally founding a civilization. They now faced the small problem of living on top of liquid mud. You can't just build cities on slime, at least, not unless you're Venetian and dangerously optimistic. The lagoon floor was a mess. Soft clay, shifting silt, and water that liked to rearrange everything twice a day. Most people would have moved. Venice said, "Let's double down." They began hammering millions of wooden piles deep into the seabed. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred. Millions. Each one had to be driven down by hand, with mallets the size of small trees. It was less construction and more collective punishment. But it worked. Beneath every Venetian building lies a forest, a hidden empire of timber, driven into the earth and preserved by the oxygenless water. That's the secret. The wood doesn't rot. It turns to stone, mineralized by centuries of salt and pressure. Every palace, every tower, every cafe where tourists now pay €14 for a cappuccino, all balanced on ancient underwater lumber that refuses to die. Venice is literally built on dead trees and denial. Then came the second layer, Istrian limestone, hauled from across the Adriatic. This stone was so dense it laughed in the face of salt water. The Venetians laid it over the piles to form platforms, slabs of solid ground floating above chaos. It was the medieval version of building an apartment complex on a Jenga tower and hoping for the best. But it worked, again. Against every law of common sense and hydrology, buildings began to rise. Churches, warehouses, and homes stacked themselves over this improbable foundation. The skyline shimmered with possibility and mild insanity. The real miracle wasn't divine, it was logistical. Imagine organizing supply lines to feed, clothe, and shelter a growing city, on islands, in water, with no land, no roads, and no patience. Every nail, every stone, every beam had to arrive by boat. It was urban planning in slow motion. And yet, somehow, Venice didn't sink. It just settled. Gracefully. Like an old nobleman refusing to admit he's had too much wine. Even though the Roman Empire had packed up and collapsed centuries earlier, it refused to leave Venice alone. Rome was like that one ex who still influences your decisions long after the breakup, haunting your infrastructure, your design choices, and occasionally, your plumbing. The early Venetians, now ankle-deep in lagoon life, were technically living among the ruins of the empire. When the mainland cities fell, they stripped the remains clean. Old Roman bricks, columns, and marble were loaded onto barges and ferried into the swamp. Nothing says fresh start, quite like rebuilding your city with someone else's leftovers. Venice became a Frankenstein's monster of Roman recycling. Every pillar, arch, and statue came from somewhere else, a travelling circus of stolen architecture. The people who couldn't keep Rome alive on land somehow resurrected it on water. And the irony? The bits of Rome they salvaged would outlast the actual Rome. They also borrowed the empire's favourite engineering trick, arches. The Romans loved arches because they could hold up half the planet with geometry and confidence. The Venetians took that idea and ran with it, or rather, paddled with it. They used arches everywhere, to span canals, reinforce walls, and support buildings that really should have collapsed centuries ago. Of course, adapting Roman architecture to a lagoon was a nightmare. You can't exactly pour concrete when your floor moves twice a day. The solution? Hydraulic improvisation. The Venetians used lime, volcanic ash, and crushed stone to create a cement that hardened underwater. Basically, Roman concrete's damp, emotionally unstable cousin. As Venice grew, it began to look like a reflection of Rome, except shinier, smaller, and with more boats. There were basilicas, forums, and squares, all built atop soggy timber and borrowed genius. Rome's grandeur, reimagined by people who were just trying not to drown. That's the real magic of early Venice. It didn't invent new engineering. It just repurposed Rome's, with better waterproofing. Where Rome conquered continents, Venice conquered buoyancy. So even as the empire faded into dust, its spirit lingered in the lagoon, carved into every column and encoded in every bridge. Rome built on rock, Venice built on faith, wood, and a complete misunderstanding of how water works. By the 8th century, the swamp had somehow become a skyline. The impossible had organized itself into neighborhoods, canals, and half-sane street plans. Venice, the accidental city, had officially taken shape. Nobody planned it. It simply happened, the way mold happens when you ignore it long enough. Clusters of muddy huts evolved into villages, villages fused into islands, and islands were stitched together by bridges and trade routes. The whole thing looked less like an architectural plan and more like a coral reef, built slowly, organically, and in defiance of logic. Venice didn't rise, it accumulated. The population exploded. Fishermen became merchants, refugees became aristocrats, and the lagoon, once a hiding place for scared Romans, turned into a floating empire run by people who had absolutely no intention of touching dry land ever again. The Venetians weren't landowners, they were waterlords. Of course, the engineering nightmare never ended. The mud still shifted, the wood still creaked, and the sea still tried to repossess the property every few years. But Venetians, being professionally stubborn, simply adapted. They built more piles, more platforms, and more prayers. Churches were raised on wooden foundations so dense they could support marble domes without collapsing, at least on weekdays. The early canals became highways. Boats ferried goods, people, gossip, and the occasional corpse from one end of the lagoon to the other. It was urban flow management before traffic lights, and it only worked because everyone was equally lost. Venice also developed its own peculiar logic of survival. Since water surrounded everything, why build walls? The sea was the wall. Invaders couldn't reach them without drowning or getting distracted by seafood. The lagoon was both moat and miracle, a natural defence system built entirely out of inconvenience. By the year 800, the city had elected its first doge, essentially a glorified mayor in a fancy hat, and declared itself independent from both empires and reality. Venice had arrived, a city of salt and strategy, wood and wealth, that somehow managed to exist between two elements, land and water, chaos and civilization. And all it took was centuries of backbreaking labour, unending anxiety, and blind confidence in timber. By the 9th century, Venice had gone from muddy refugee camp to thriving aquatic tax haven. The swamp dwellers had evolved into merchants, sailors, and politicians who looked at water and saw opportunity, and probably a few unpaid docking fees. Venice wasn't built on land, so it didn't behave like a land city. It didn't have walls, farms, or horses. It had gondolas, sailors, and people who could balance on boats better than they could walk. It was a city designed by fish, for people who refused to drown. The lagoon that once kept invaders out became a gateway to the world. The Venetians turned their swamp into a naval empire, building ships faster than other nations could sink them. Their fleets connected Constantinople, Egypt, and the rest of Europe, trading everything from spices to silk to mild political corruption. Every dockyard was an orchestra of chaos, hammers pounding, ropes snapping, sailors yelling, and someone inevitably falling in. The Venetians became masters of maritime engineering, designing lightweight, fast ships that could outrun pirates and outmaneuver rivals. These weren't just traders. They were weaponized accountants with sails, and the city itself was booming. not figuratively, but audibly. Construction never stopped. Palaces grew out of the lagoon like coral reefs covered in marble. Every family that made money immediately tried to prove it by building a house slightly taller, shinier, or more impractical than their neighbours. If your home didn't threaten to collapse under its own luxury, were you even Venetian? The economy was booming too, mostly because Venice invented capitalism while pretending it was civic duty. The Doge ruled with elegance, the merchants ruled with ledgers, and the commoners ruled with gossip. Together, they created a government so complicated it made Rome look like a lemonade stand. Venice had no natural resources, no farmland, and no army. Just ships, ambition, and saltwater confidence. Somehow, that was enough. By the 11th century, Venice wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The swamp people had become the water people, the middlemen of the medieval world. They didn't conquer land, they conquered logistics. And that, in the Middle Ages, was far more profitable. If you ever visit Venice and wonder why there are no streets, the answer is simple. They tried, and the streets sank. The city quickly realized that in a place where the ground behaves like pudding, wheels were useless. So they chose boats. Boats don't mind floods, and they don't need paving. A win-win for any civilization founded on mud. Thus, Venice reinvented urban planning. While the rest of Europe was arguing over cobblestones, the Venetians dug channels. Every neighbourhood was built around water routes like veins in a living creature. The canals weren't decoration. They were roads, sewers, and occasionally bathtubs. It wasn't elegant at first. Early canals were basically ditches filled with regret. But the Venetians, being stubborn perfectionists, dredged and reshaped them until the lagoon became an aquatic grid system. They lined the edges with stone embankments, turning marshy chaos into navigable beauty. What started as survival engineering became urban poetry. And so, the gondola was born, sleek, quiet, and just narrow enough to fit through alleys that double as rivers. Each one was handcrafted and asymmetrical to compensate for the rower's single oar. It was the medieval equivalent of a luxury sports car, except it smelled faintly of salt and existential dread. Life flowed with the tides. Deliveries came by boat, funerals by boat, weddings by boat. Even arguments were conducted mid-canal, with shouting gondoliers throwing insults instead of punches. Venice became a city where people didn't walk. They glided. Of course, this also meant you couldn't casually leave your house without risking a swim. A single wrong step and you were part of the fish ecosystem. Children learned to row before they learned to run. And yet, somehow, it all worked. The canals became Venice's identity. While other medieval cities were choking on smoke and mud, Venice shimmered, clean, reflective, and slightly smug about it. The water that once threatened to drown them now carried their wealth, their art, and their attitude. Venice had done the impossible. It built civilization not on top of nature, but with it, a partnership between human madness and tidal patience. It wasn't just a city anymore. It was a floating experiment in controlled chaos. By the 12th century, Venice had stopped pretending to be humble. The city that once hid from barbarians was now flaunting marble palaces and bell towers, all standing miraculously on water. It was as if the Venetians looked at the laws of physics and said, "We hear you." We just don't care Venetian architecture was born from defiance, not of enemies, but of gravity. The builders knew their foundations were wooden stilts jammed into sludge, yet they decided to pile several tons of limestone and marble on top anyway. It's the kind of optimism that could only come from a people who live in denial every high tide. Each building was a gamble. The Doge's Palace, the Basilica di San Marco, the endless row of palazzi along the Grand Canal, all of them testaments to human ego and good waterproofing. Every facade sparkled with Byzantine mosaics, Gothic arches, and enough ornamentation to make Rome jealous. The result? A skyline so delicate it looks like it's about to fall over, but refuses to out of spite. To outsiders, Venice seemed enchanted. To locals, it was just stressful. The weight of all that beauty was literally dragging the city down. A slow-motion collapse they called subsidence, or as modern engineers put it, "We told you so." But Venetians didn't stop. They doubled down on their floating empire, layering palaces like pancakes and carving windows shaped like dreams. Architects obsessed over light, how it bounced off canals, reflected off marble, and blinded visiting diplomats just enough to make them sign bad trade deals. Everything in Venice was designed to impress. Churches that shimmered at dawn, bridges that arched with impossible grace, and squares paved like chessboards for the wealthy to stroll across, pretending they weren't standing on a glorified raft. It wasn't practicality, it was theatre. Venice wasn't built to survive, it was built to perform. Every brick, every statue, every mirrored ripple of water declared the same thing. Yes, this is insane. And yes, it's working. While the rest of Europe built castles on hills, Venice built palaces on water. Because if you're going to risk everything on a swamp, you might as well make it look fabulous. For all its beauty, Venice has always lived in an abusive relationship with the sea. The lagoon giveth, the lagoon taketh away, usually while flooding your living room. The same water that carried Venice's trade, reflected its palaces, and kept barbarians away also quietly ate the city from below, molecule by molecule. Salt water is nature's slowest, pettiest assassin. It seeps into brick, corrodes stone, and leaves behind a crust of glittering ruin. Every day, the tide licked the city's foundations like a cat testing its prey, waiting for the moment gravity would give up. The Venetians called it aqua alta, high water, but really it was just the sea reminding them who was boss. To survive, the Venetians became obsessive maintainers, the medieval version of people who vacuum before guests arrive, except their guests were floods. They scraped barnacles, replaced rotting piles, patched cracks with lime and prayers. The city employed entire crews whose full-time job was arguing with the ocean. Stone was the worst victim. The famous Istrian limestone, chosen for its toughness, could resist salt longer than most marriages, but even it surrendered eventually. The lower walls of buildings began to crumble, turning palaces into salt-lick sculptures. Residents adapted by moving their furniture upstairs, not because of feng shui, but because downstairs had become part of the lagoon. Venetians didn't panic. They innovated. They built water barriers, raised thresholds, and installed secret floodgates in churches that were supposed to symbolize humility. They became masters of denial, literally. If the water rose, they just pretended the city had a second floor. And yet, in the quiet hours after a storm, when the moonlight shimmered on the flooded piazzas, Venice looked ethereal, beautiful because it was fragile, proud because it was doomed. The saltwater enemy was relentless, but so were the Venetians. Their battle wasn't about victory. It was about endurance, a centuries-long standoff between architecture and chemistry. Most cities die of conquest, plague, or neglect. Venice is being gently dissolved by the same element that made it rich. And the people? They still sip espresso while their floors glisten underwater, muttering the city's unofficial motto, "It could be worse. At least it's not raining." By the 13th century, Venice wasn't just a city anymore. It was an empire on training wheels. While everyone else in Europe was stabbing each other for farmland, Venice was busy writing laws, counting money, and pretending wood doesn't sink. Somehow, this floating experiment had turned into a functioning republic. The government of Venice was a bureaucratic masterpiece, part democracy, part aristocracy, part group therapy session. At the top sat the Doge, elected for life but mostly trapped in ceremonies and elaborate hats. Beneath him were councils, committees, subcommittees, and the Council of Ten, which sounds like a band but was actually the most feared political machine in Europe. It handled espionage, corruption, and the occasional mysterious disappearance, all in writing, of course. Running a republic on stilts came with unique challenges. There were no city walls, no farmlands, and not much solid ground to store secrets. So Venice became obsessed with paper. Contracts, treaties, maritime codes, all neatly archived, while the floorboards creaked beneath them. Diplomats described the city as a masterpiece of order built entirely on chaos. They weren't wrong. Venetian politics ran on two things: trade and paranoia. The city's power depended on the sea, and the sea was unpredictable, just like its rivals. Every citizen was part merchant, part spy. Information moved faster than ships, and gossip was currency. You didn't just sell silk or salt, you sold intel. Venice basically invented LinkedIn, but wetter. Meanwhile, the economy flourished. The Arsenale, Venice's shipyard, could build a galley in a single day, centuries before mass production became a buzzword. Imagine an assembly line powered by hammers, rope, and loud opinions. Ships rolled out daily, carrying goods, soldiers, and sometimes questionable morals. And through it all, the city balanced, literally. The same creaking foundations that held palaces now held the machinery of government. Every decision, every law, every pile-driven compromise kept Venice afloat in more ways than one. The Republic of Venice wasn't born from ideology. It was born from logistics. It worked not because it was fair or moral, but because it was organized, ruthlessly, beautifully, and with just enough corruption to stay interesting. In short, Venice didn't rise through conquest. It rose through paperwork. By the 15th century, Venice had entered its Renaissance era, the golden age when art, money, and ego collided beautifully. The city was rich beyond reason, glittering with trade profits and moral flexibility. It had no land, no army, and no fresh water. But it did have painters, philosophers, and a collective belief that marble could fix anything. Venetian nobles began competing to see who could build the most beautiful house on the most unstable foundation. Yes, my palace leans slightly, one might say, but look at the reflection. The Grand Canal became an architectural catwalk where every facade screamed, "I'm wealthy, please notice before I collapse." This was also the age of Palladio, Titian, and Tintoretto, men who painted, built, and decorated as if the city weren't sinking beneath them. Churches glowed with mosaics made from crushed gemstones, and ceilings turned into oil-painted heavens. Venice became a masterpiece balancing on anxiety. Of course, all that beauty came with weight, literal tons of it. Each new palace pressed harder into the mud, forcing the city to sink faster. It was the Renaissance version of overdrafting your architectural credit card. Engineers begged for restraint, artists laughed and ordered more marble. Meanwhile, the lagoon began to exact its revenge. Salt crept into everything: walls, art, even people's shoes. The lower floors of buildings turned into amphibious habitats, and the city developed a new fashion trend: permanent dampness. Still, no one cared. Venice had become Europe's mirror, a city of light, reflection, and delightful denial. Visitors called it the Jewel of the Sea. Locals called it Tuesday. The whole place shimmered, floating somewhere between divine inspiration and structural failure. But even as the beauty reached perfection, something underneath was cracking. The trade routes were shifting, the Ottoman Empire was flexing, and the city's wealth was beginning to evaporate like mist. The Golden Age glittered because everyone was too polite to admit the tide was rising. Venice, in all her painted glory, had built her Renaissance on borrowed time and borrowed lumber. The city wasn't defying gravity anymore. It was negotiating with it, one tide at a time. Venice had a problem, and for once it wasn't flooding. It was logistics. By the 16th century, the Grand Canal had become the city's main artery, wide, majestic, and utterly inconvenient to cross. There were ferries, yes, but they were slow, wet, and smelled like wet democracy. The people demanded a bridge. Now, most cities would just build one and move on. Venice, however, debated the matter for decades, because every architect knew that putting a stone bridge across a moving body of water resting on mud was optimistic. But in true Venetian fashion, they decided to do it anyway. Elegantly and with maximum risk. Enter the Rialto Bridge, completed in 1591, the most beautiful engineering gamble in Renaissance Europe. It was a single-span stone arch stretching 24 metres across the Grand Canal, balanced perfectly on thousands of timber piles beneath. Critics said it would collapse immediately. Engineers said it was impossible. The Venetians said, "Hold my wine." They built it in 3 years. No scaffolding, no steel, no margin for error, just math, marble, and unreasonable confidence. When the bridge opened, people walked across it cautiously, waiting for disaster. But the thing refused to fall, as if gravity itself was too impressed to interfere. The Rialto became more than a bridge. It was a stage. Shops lined both sides, selling jewellery, silk, and probably overpriced souvenirs even then. It connected the city's two hearts, the market of San Polo and the grandeur of San Marco, in one sweeping gesture of arrogance and grace. Other cities built bridges to get somewhere. Venice built one to show off. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a flex post. Look at me. I'm standing on physics. And of course, it became an instant icon. Travellers marvelled at its impossible curve. Artists painted it obsessively, and locals used it as an excellent place to overhear gossip. The Rialto Bridge didn't just connect two sides of Venice. It connected centuries of madness into one arch of stone and ego. Even now, when tourists crowd its steps for selfies, they're standing on a 400-year-old reminder that human arrogance occasionally pays off. Usually, it sinks. But in Venice, it somehow floats. By the late Renaissance, Venice had become the world's most glamorous science experiment. The city wasn't just built near water. It was built with it, on it, and occasionally under it. Every tide, every storm, every full moon was a reminder that living here required equal parts faith and physics. So the Venetians became scientists, not the kind with lab coats, but the kind with damp boots and a deep distrust of gravity. They studied tides, salinity, and sediment flow centuries before anyone coined the word hydrology. They knew exactly how much silt the rivers brought in and how much the sea took out. Venice wasn't just surviving the lagoon, it was managing it like a high-maintenance relationship. The biggest problem was silt. Rivers dumped tons of it into the lagoon, threatening to turn Venice back into the swamp it started as. So, what did the Venetians do? They redirected the rivers, not metaphorically, literally. They dug new channels to send the Brenta and Piave rivers elsewhere, away from the lagoon. It was environmental manipulation on a godlike scale, carried out by men in tights. Of course, these projects were risky. Diverting rivers could easily flood nearby towns, but that wasn't Venice's problem. Those towns were on land, and therefore unimportant. Then came the floodgates. Wooden barriers designed to hold back the worst tides. They weren't perfect, but they gave the illusion of control, which is really all humanity has ever wanted from nature. Venetian engineers were basically the first to look at the ocean and say, "You work for me now." The city's obsession with balance became both its brilliance and its curse. Everything, tides, trade, architecture, even politics, was a delicate equation that had to be constantly adjusted. One wrong calculation, and you'd wake up owning a fish farm instead of a bedroom. But somehow, the system worked. The canals stayed open, the foundations held, and the city continued its improbable float through history. Venice didn't conquer the sea. It negotiated with it, politely, repeatedly, for 600 years. It was less an empire, and more a centuries-long maintenance plan, the most beautiful ongoing repair job in the world. By the 16th century, Venice had reached its theatrical peak, rich, radiant, and completely unaware that it was performing its own slow-motion tragedy. The city was a superstar entering its decadent phase, flawless on the surface, crumbling underneath. Trade was declining, empires were shifting, and the lagoon was turning from protector to predator. But denial was Venice's favourite art form. The merchants noticed fewer ships. The engineers noticed more floods. The nobles noticed nothing. They were too busy commissioning portraits of themselves pretending not to care. The truth was simple. Venice was sinking. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally. The wooden piles beneath the city were still strong, but the ground around them wasn't. The clay compressed. The water rose. The city began to settle lower each century, like a nobleman after too much wine. The symptoms were everywhere. Doors that once opened onto the street now opened into the canal. Lower floors became unusable, so Venetians simply moved upstairs and called it renovation. The city quietly adjusted its expectations. Engineers proposed solutions, raising the streets, building higher embankments, praying harder. Each one helped for a decade before the sea shrugged and came back stronger. Nature, it turned out, was not interested in architectural negotiation, but instead of despairing, Venice turned its decay into an aesthetic. Artists painted its soft light, its quiet melancholy, its shimmering reflections of ruin. Writers described it as a city caught between life and memory. In truth, it was caught between tides. Even the tourists, early ones dressed in lace and idealism, loved it more for its fragility. Venice became Europe's favourite dying beauty, tragic, glamorous, and slightly damp. Meanwhile, the Venetians carried on like professionals. The government still met, the gondoliers still argued, and the Doge still waved politely from balconies that were slowly sinking out of view. Venice wasn't collapsing overnight. It was rehearsing collapse indefinitely. A city too proud to die quickly. It was still rich, still beautiful, still ridiculous, just wetter. The engineers took notes, the poets wept, and the sea kept applauding. Because even drowning, Venice knew how to make it look graceful. 5 centuries later, Venice is still standing, or rather, hovering suspiciously close to not standing at all. The same wooden piles driven into mud 1,000 years ago are still there, holding up a Renaissance dream that refuses to admit it's mostly luck. It's a miracle of endurance and poor planning. The city never truly conquered nature. It just negotiated with it, daily, with the patience of a tired marriage. The sea rises, Venice adjusts. The salt eats, Venice repaints. Floods come, Venetians shrug and order espresso. Every inch of the city is an argument between human pride and the physics of water. Modern engineers call it subsidence. Locals call it Tuesday. The streets flood, the tourists panic, and the gondoliers carry on singing like this is fine. Because to them, it is. They've been living in a slow apocalypse for centuries. When you've seen entire empires vanish under the waves of history, a little high tide doesn't scare you. The real secret of Venice isn't its beauty. It's its refusal to die properly. It's too stubborn, too proud, too aware that the world is still watching. The city that began as a refugee camp in a swamp became a republic, an empire, an art gallery, and finally, a cautionary tale about building anything near water. And yet, it endures. Every bridge and canal is part of a choreography, a centuries-long balancing act between ambition and decay. The same marble that dazzled the Renaissance still glows at sunset, its reflection rippling in the canals like time itself laughing softly. The city may sink, but its image never does. Venice is not a monument. It's a performance, one that's been running for 1,500 years without intermission. The actors change, the water rises, the set warps a little, but the show goes on, and maybe that's the real lesson of Venice. You don't need to win against nature. You just need good lighting, excellent balance, and the confidence to keep pretending it's all under control. The rest is maintenance. High in the fog-drenched Alborz Mountains, where the wind whispered through stone and legend, a fortress named Alamut guarded more than walls. It guarded an idea. To the common folk, it was the eagle's nest, a citadel unreachable and unseen, ruled by men who spoke softly, yet made empires tremble. From here, Hassani Sabah, the enigmatic old man of the mountain, created not merely a sect, but a myth that would ripple across continents. The Hashashin, or Nizari Ismailis as they truly were, emerged in the 11th century. born from the fractures of Islam itself. Amidst the political chaos between Sunni Abbasids and Shia Fatimids, Hassan built something radical, a disciplined order bound not by blood, but by purpose. They pledged absolute loyalty to him, to the cause of divine knowledge, and to a dream of spiritual freedom that terrified kings and caliphs alike. Training was rigorous. Recruits lived like monks, studying philosophy, theology, and the art of infiltration. They didn't fight wars of armies, but wars of patience. To them, one blade in the right place could change the balance of nations. To their enemies, they were ghosts in white robes who struck from nowhere, left a message carved in fear, and vanished into mountain mist. But the name Hashashin, from which the modern word assassin descends, was a gift of propaganda. Enemies whispered that Hassan's followers were drugged with hashish before missions, that they saw paradise in hallucination, and thus feared no death. Marco Polo later carried that tale to Europe, claiming to have heard of gardens filled with houris and rivers of wine, where these killers believed they'd awaken after martyrdom. Truth, however, was far more sober, and far more frightening, for the real power of the Hashashin lay not in intoxication but in intellect. They infiltrated courts, brokered information, and turned assassination into strategy. When a caliph, crusader, or vizier woke to find a dagger planted beside his pillow, it was a warning, not a death sentence. "We could have killed you," the message said. "Next time, we will." From those mountain citadels, a network of fear and fascination spread. And though centuries would bury them, their name, half myth, half memory, would survive every empire that tried to erase it. Before the legend of daggers and gardens, there was a man, a scholar, strategist, and zealot, named Hassan-i Sabah. Born in Qom, Persia, around 1050, Hassan grew up in a world of scholars and theologians, where faith and politics danced in constant tension. He was a prodigy, intelligent, austere, and utterly convinced that truth could be found only through reason guided by faith. He studied under the Fatimids in Cairo, absorbing the doctrines of the Ismaili sect. Yet even among fanatics, Hassan was exceptional. His brilliance earned him both respect and exile. The Fatimid caliph in Cairo, suspicious of Hassan's ambition, cast him out, a move that would, ironically, create his most dangerous enemy. Hassan fled east, moving like a phantom through Persia until he found his sanctuary, the fortress of Alamut, perched like a falcon's perch above the world. Through wit, persuasion, and possibly a touch of manipulation, he seized control of it in 1090 without spilling a drop of blood. The legend says he infiltrated the fortress disguised as a teacher, converting the garrison one man at a time until the castle itself bowed to him. Once inside, Hassan transformed Alamut into more than a fortress. It became a university, a monastery, and an intelligence hub all in one. Every disciple was carefully chosen and tested. The young men were taught theology, philosophy, and languages, but also disguise, stealth, and the anatomy of a perfect kill. He forbade indulgence, demanded silence, and preached that martyrdom was not death, but union with the divine. His men were so devoted that they would leap from towers at his command to prove their loyalty, an act that horrified outsiders and immortalized his authority. Hassan's leadership was not one of fear, but faith, weaponized. He ruled for 35 years without leaving Alamut once, directing operations through letters, coded messages, and whispers carried by loyal couriers. Assassinations under his command were surgical. Viziers, generals, even Seljuk princes fell by daggers guided by his ideology. To his enemies, Hassan was a madman cloaked in sanctity. To his followers, he was the proof that divine truth could be achieved through absolute discipline. In the shadowed chambers of Alamut, he became both prophet and puppeteer, the mind behind the myth that would one day terrify the entire medieval world. Inside the stone walls of Alamut, discipline was scripture. Hassan-i Sabah's creed demanded more than faith. It required surrender of the self. The men who came to serve him were stripped of family ties, wealth, and identity. They emerged as feeders, those who sacrifice. To them, death was not punishment, but fulfillment. Hassan's genius lay in transforming belief into obedience so complete that even empires feared to whisper his name. Each initiate's training began not with weapons, but with silence. They learned to fast, to watch, to wait. They memorized texts from the Quran and from Ismaili philosophy until thought itself became a weapon. Only when their minds were sharpened were they taught the blade. Every motion was ritual, the drawing of the dagger, the strike, the retreat. Failure was not permitted. Those who hesitated never returned from their missions, and those who succeeded became living shadows. It wasn't brute strength that made the Hashashin dangerous. It was precision. Unlike the wild raids of crusaders or the massed armies of sultans, their strikes were personal, surgical, and theatrical. They did not kill for pleasure or loot. They killed to deliver messages. A single assassination might halt an invasion, end a feud, or reshape a dynasty's policy overnight. Hassan had created the first psychological warfare network long before the term existed, and yet their creed was not chaos. Hassan's assassins followed strict moral parameters. Their targets were chosen with deliberation, often men who had betrayed pacts, persecuted the Ismailis, or threatened their survival. To kill without purpose was forbidden. To die without conviction was shameful. In time, their methods inspired terror bordering on superstition. The dagger left on a pillow, the whisper in the dark, the rumour of a man smiling before death, all became signatures of the Hashashin. Even hardened generals would pray before sleeping, fearing that a servant or bodyguard might already be one of Hassan's own. To outsiders, they were fanatics. But within Alamut's halls, they saw themselves as soldiers of truth, men who believed that one act of sacrifice could purify a world poisoned by corruption. Their creed was simple yet absolute. The blade serves not hatred, but destiny. And in that, they found both purpose and peace. By the early 12th century, the name Hashashin had already begun to crawl through the corridors of power like a chill. The first confirmed assassinations were not random acts of terror, but strategic executions, carried out with almost theatrical precision. Hassani Saba's men didn't merely kill, they performed death. Each strike was both message and miracle, a demonstration of reach that mocked every fortress, guard and army on earth. Their first great target was Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, a man whose influence stretched across Persia and Syria. In 1092, disguised as a wandering dervish, a lone feeder approached the vizier's litter under the pretext of presenting a petition. When the vizier unrolled the paper, the assassin plunged a dagger into his heart. The fidar was instantly cut down by guards, but the message had been delivered. Even the mightiest minister was not beyond the mountain's grasp. News of the killing spread like wildfire, and with it came a kind of awe. The Hashashin had no armies, yet they wielded the power of fear more effectively than any legion. They operated with surgical intelligence, blending faith, politics, and theatre into one potent formula. Each mission was designed to echo, to whisper through the courts of sultans and crusader kings alike. Soon, assassination became diplomacy. Princes who once cursed Hassan's name began to send him tribute, desperate to buy safety. Rumours swirled that the Hashashin maintained spies in every royal court, that no oath or alliance was safe. Even crusaders in distant Jerusalem spoke of them in hushed tones, believing them to be invisible servants of death. But Hassan was not reckless. Each strike was chosen to maximize terror with minimal bloodshed. Killing one ruler could paralyze 10 armies. Leaving a warning dagger on a pillow could achieve more than a massacre. Hassan's true genius lay not in the act of murder, but in the threat of it. The result was paradoxical. Peace through fear. Villages near Alamut slept soundly, untouched by war, because everyone knew that crossing Hassan's path meant vanishing from history. It was controlled by myth, and Hassan was its invisible emperor, ruling the world from his eagle's nest with nothing but whispers and blades. When Marco Polo passed through the East 2 centuries later, he brought with him one of history's most enduring and misleading legends. He claimed that Hassani Sabah lured young men into his service using an earthly paradise, a secret garden filled with wine, women, and wonder. Drugged with hashish, the initiates would awaken in this artificial Eden, believing they had glimpsed the rewards of martyrdom. When they awoke again in Alamut, Hassan would tell them, "Serve me, and you shall return to paradise forever." It was a story made for medieval Europe, a tale of Eastern decadence and devilish cunning. But while it captured imaginations from Venice to Paris, the truth was less indulgent and far more intelligent. There is no record, in any Persian or Arabic source, of such a garden ever existing. The myth likely came from hostile chroniclers eager to portray the Ismailis as heretics, intoxicated by drugs and illusion. To the Sunni orthodoxy, calling them hashish users, hashashin, was a way to strip them of legitimacy, to turn a disciplined religious order into a pack of fanatics. Yet, as with all effective propaganda, there was a seed of psychological brilliance buried in the tale. Hassan did not need narcotics to inspire devotion. He had created his own paradise through belief. His fortress at Alamut was designed to simulate perfection. Fertile terraces, clear streams, libraries filled with books, halls that echoed with debate instead of drunkenness. In a sense, Hassan had indeed built Eden, not of sensual pleasure, but of intellectual and spiritual transcendence. Still, the myth of the hashish garden stuck, for it explained what outsiders could not comprehend. How men could walk unflinchingly into death with calm smiles and steady hands. To crusaders and chroniclers, it was easier to believe in drugged obedience than in spiritual conviction. And so, the name assassins, born from slander, would become their immortal brand. Hassan never corrected the rumour. He didn't need to. Let kings believe his men were demons. Let chroniclers think they were dreamers, high on paradise smoke. The more unbelievable the story, the greater its power. In that silence, the old man of the mountain understood the first rule of myth-making. The lie that terrifies is worth more than the truth that reassures. When the Crusaders stormed into the Holy Land in the late 11th century, they came expecting clear lines of loyalty, Christians on one side, Muslims on the other. What they found instead was a landscape of fractured allegiances, shifting alliances, and one mysterious faction that seemed to serve no one but themselves, the Hashashin. Neither holy friend nor foe, they were a paradox wrapped in shadow. At first the Crusaders dismissed them as mountain bandits, until bodies began to appear, bodies of men too powerful to fall so easily. The most infamous case was Conrad of Montferrat, king-elect of Jerusalem, murdered in 1192. Two assassins, disguised as monks, approached him as he walked through the narrow streets of Tyre. They greeted him respectfully, then drew daggers from beneath their robes and stabbed him before being cut down. To the Crusaders, this was an act of pure evil. To the Hashashin, it was business. The Templars and Hospitallers soon learned that the assassins could be both ally and enemy, depending on who paid the tribute. Richard the Lionheart is rumoured to have negotiated with them, while Saladin himself survived multiple assassination attempts. Once, after an unsuccessful attack, he reportedly awoke to find a dagger and note left on his pillow. "You are in our power." The message was not just a threat, it was a reminder that even the mighty Sultan was mortal. In their strange neutrality, the Hashashin became a political wildcard. They attacked both Christian and Muslim leaders, but never for faith, only for purpose. Some Crusader chroniclers even admired them, describing their courage and the eerie calm with which they faced death. Others, horrified, claimed they were demons who worshipped false gods in the mountains. Their influence extended beyond swords and politics. They introduced Europe to the idea of the invisible killer, the man who moves unseen, acts alone, and topples empires with one well-placed strike. In time, that idea would outlive the sect itself, shaping everything from medieval paranoia to modern espionage. To the Crusaders, the Hashashin were a mystery that defied the logic of chivalry. They fought without banners, prayed without priests, and killed without armies. A mirror held up to the arrogance of kings and knights who believed that power could only come from force. Alamut was more than a fortress. It was a statement carved in stone. Perched high in the Elburz Mountains, it seemed to defy the world below, a citadel built not just for war, but for thought. While Crusader castles bristled with towers and catapults,